Frankly, this was, I believe, the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country, and maybe beyond. And now it's going to reach a new level of importance because we're going to help our country heal. We're going to help our country heal. We have a country that needs help, and it needs help very badly. We're going to fix our borders. We're going to fix everything about our country.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another Tabadlab Live. We've had a few of these in quick succession, but of course, a momentous occasion in the United States. And to talk about the US election, what just happened and how we got here and what happens next, I'm joined by a very dear friend and fellow student, I suppose, Uzair Younus from the Asia Group. Uzair is a well-known entity for those that are in any way associated with the Tabadlab. It's great to have you on, and I think this is the first time we're doing this from this platform. So thanks for doing it, Uzair.
Thanks for having me, Mosharraf. And it seems like I'm on the other side of the questions this time around. Usually it's you that I'm asking the questions to.
Well, let's see how that goes, because as you know, I'm not a very good listener. Let's start with how your night has been and how you've perceived it, just your own sort of perception of what's been happening. It's 5:30 a.m. in the U.S., in Washington, where you are, and it looks like it's not just a victory, but it seems like, I wouldn't say thumping, but certainly a comprehensive, like there's not going to be any confusion at the end of this process. The last numbers I saw were 266 to 214. Tell me about your night. Have you been up all night? Did you get some sleep? What's the mood? What just happened?
Well, I did get some sleep. I sort of called it in my own head at around 1:30 a.m. and was like, it's time to go home. But it was interesting in the sense that you kind of had the initial sort of around 10:30 p.m. Eastern time results coming in. They were trending in sort of the way most anticipated, right? That there would be some mirages, some numbers that'll come aggressively for either candidate. But it was really around that time that at least I started feeling that this was more like 2016 and less like 2020, in the sense that, you were seeing slippages in core constituencies where Kamala Harris was expected to run up big leads. So that was one that was very interesting. For me, the big sort of moment that was like, okay, this is not going to be a comeback and the wall may not hold, was actually New York, a city you're deeply, deeply familiar with and where I also lived. And the just slide that you saw in the numbers in both New York, Manhattan, Queens, and Hudson County, which is across the river, was just indicative of the fact that not only is he leading, but, winning the popular vote in places that you would have thought unimaginable.
Why is that? I mean, we've been talking in the run-up to the election, and we have, as we always do, differing views on this. It felt to me like there was a real authenticity challenge that the Harris campaign suffered from, and I think it was exacerbated by the Tim Walz selection. If she'd selected better, and let me say controversially, if gender was no factor, because I do think it was a factor, but I want you to talk a little bit about how much of a factor do you think it was?
Yeah, so I mean, there are sort of two structural issues, right, that the Harris-Walz campaign had, which was they were running the shortest presidential campaign in history, given that Joe Biden was the presumptive nominee and through the first debate was expected to be running this race, right? So here was a vice president whose team, whose infrastructure was not in any way, shape, or form ready for election. I think that was a structural problem. The second structural problem, obviously, was the fact that instead of doing an open primary at that point in time, given where and how deeply polarized America is, they stuck it out with the norm that, okay, if it's not the president, it has to be the vice president. Some in the party questioned it, and I think they've been proven right with that, the numbers that have come out tonight and last night. I think on the gender side, what's been interesting to me, I was going through some of the early data coming out where abortion was on the ballot, right? So states like Missouri, for example, that overwhelmingly voted to enshrine the right to reproductive health for women, but then Kamala Harris trails, right? Same thing in Florida. 3 percentage point, the measure failed. You need 60% there. But 57% of voters voting for the right to abortion in Florida. But the state overwhelmingly went for Trump, right? So I think that's a lens through which you can sort of say that gender and reproductive health as a topic was on the ballot, and voters sort of decided they're going to choose for that on the ballot, but not vote for the presidency based off of that perspective.
Does that, to your mind, does that signify a sophistication, especially to voters in Missouri, that, ordinarily people on the West Coast or the East Coast, people like you and I, when I'm in the U.S., we don't really associate that kind of sophistication. And even in the way you framed it, it was like, well, they voted on the issue in one case and not on the issue in the other. But another way to interpret it was there might be that voters in the Deep South, voters in the Midwest, voters that we think might be informed by racial prejudice or cultural or civilizational prejudice are actually, they may still have those issues, but they're actually quite sophisticated in the way that they make choices about who governs them and what freedoms they want to keep and what freedoms they're willing to concede.
I mean, this is a perennial question, right? And it's been a question plaguing, I would say, not just left of center parties in the United States, but even in Western Europe, is, this dismissive attitude or this, what is perceived as this arrogance of the fact that we know better, we, the college educated elite, or the media elite know better, and you're not sophisticated enough, right? And I think as the numbers have come in this race, like, it's pretty evident that voters in places like Missouri, in places like Florida, have that level of sophistication where they have chosen to send, in certain places, representatives from the opposing party to Congress, while voting for somebody else on the top of the ticket, or on measures that, such as I mentioned, right? And I think that's going to be a big problem. And I think that's where even the dissection of the erosion of support in the Latino population across parts of America, including Pennsylvania, will be deeply studied, because I don't think it's just men. It could be primarily Latino men that broke for Donald Trump at the end of the day. But there has been a consistent erosion of support for the Democrats, if you look at it from the Obama era all the way to today, in places like Philadelphia County, right, which is like the heart of, if you want to win Pennsylvania as a Democrat, you got to carry that in a big margin. So I think there is sophistication. And final point on this, Mosharraf, and again, we've talked about this offline quite a lot, it's the changing media environment, right? That people get access to information through decentralized media platforms that are poo-pooed more so by the snooty college-educated elites, more so than the rugged right of center Donald Trump type voters. And this is not just an American phenomenon, it's globally. And that also, I think we should appreciate the fact that it played a key role in terms of information access and voter intent.
There's a whole separate conversation, and I don't want to get into it, but just because we're speaking, I think it's important to acknowledge that some of this snootiness is something that present company might even be afflicted by, in terms of the way that in Pakistan, certain folks like myself have perceived PTI supporters, for example. And so a lot of the animus that Republicans that vote for Trump or PTI supporters that vote for Imran Khan, again, not to create an exact parallel, but a lot of that aggression or animus is really informed by this perceived arrogance. I would claim that it's not been arrogance, but there's certainly this dismissive, I think you used the exact right word, this dismissive view that, hey, you don't understand this stuff, and hey, I got this, like, let us, and this is the right answer. And of course, what social media and these algorithms have done is they've blown that up. Now, talk a little bit about where the risks are in all of this, because certainly it whereas one can acknowledge that there is sophistication and people are actually a lot smarter than people would give them credit for, it's also the case that these machines and these algorithms and these interest groups that are aligning or coalescing around this populist leader named Donald Trump do have their own interests. I mean, I think the best case study would be Elon Musk and the way in which he's really moved, I think, 180 degrees on the issue of tariffs versus China, for example. What is happening there? How is this dynamic playing out, and what will it do to the Trump 2 presidency?
Yeah, I mean, look, Elon is a classic case in point, right? Where a lot of the broader elite interest conversation can be summed up. He has tremendous exposure to China as a business owner, with Tesla and other businesses and his supply chain there. So Donald Trump that goes after China in the way he's promised is disastrous in the near term for Tesla. On the flip side, Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers are outcompeting global electric vehicle manufacturers all over the place, including in Europe. And the Biden administration, for example, has pushed tariffs, as has Western Europe, on Chinese EVs. So he benefits from those kinds of tariffs, right? But then again, there is a contradiction here because Donald Trump and his core base is not pro EV. So all of a sudden, Elon is going to have to deal with a presidency that perhaps may pursue things that he may not really like and his shareholders may not like, right? And that's going to be a problem. In addition to that, there's been a broader conversation on how do you regulate social media. That conversation, I think Elon has managed quite well, given X and the support he's provided to the Trump campaign on X. So that helps him. But I think overall, the risk here, in particular for the United States and for the world, is that you have a leader in the shape and form of Donald Trump that is quite disruptive, that does not hold any ideological moorings in the way that old school Democrats like Joe Biden or even old school Republicans like a George Bush did, which means he's unpredictable. And he's going to do things that make sense to him, even if it puts him at odds with his own cabinet. We've seen that in the last term as well, and so that uncertainty will grow. I think the second issue domestically for the United States is that the near-term policy path that he may choose expands the fiscal deficit, and the contradiction there is that if you pursue aggressive cuts or expansion of the fiscal deficit, you are going to pressure the trade deficit. So how do you then manage that as a president who wants to cut the trade deficit is another question. And then I think finally, Musharraf, this election in by no way, shape, or form marks an end to the polarization that has plagued America since the global financial crisis. The numbers may be huge in terms of the electoral college count that comes out at the end of the day, but the margin that has shifted is 2 to 3 percentage points, and that's it. So this is still a deeply, deeply divided country. And it'll be interesting to see what Donald Trump does in terms of pushing an agenda that perhaps half of the country does not appreciate at this point in time.
Half of the country for in the US's case is over 150 million people, so maybe that's a canvas that's too large. But maybe now if we could shift a little bit to specific interest groups, and I think you've already dealt with women and Latinos as interest groups, but the one that of course you and I talk a lot about, and the ones that we both have direct stakes in, me through direct family and you as an American Muslim. What happened with Michigan, and how was the decision making of Muslims in America who felt that the Democrats were really disloyal to, I think a sustained engagement between American Muslims and the Democratic Party that certainly began sometime in the early years of Bush and probably broke within the last year. And I think that Gaza has been the sort of turning point in this, and there's no escaping that conversation. So talk a little bit about how that conversation was going and what you're seeing in the numbers from Michigan. And then as a second part to that, and we can come to that later, talk a little bit about what we anticipate Trump might do in the Middle East. But let's start with the buildup and where American Muslims are, and whether it's fair to even refer to them in that mass sort of collective noun sense.
So it was interesting, Musharraf. I woke up this morning and I had a message from one of our common friends, Amar Khan, who shared the Michigan numbers with me and was like, you remember a year ago, we had this conversation at your place. You were around the table at my place that evening as well. And this is what we talked about, right? That the policy on Gaza had, at that time, you were saying, has a very serious likelihood of making this an Iraq war-like inflection point in terms of where the community goes. And obviously 20 years after the Iraq war, the community is much larger and much more influential in places like Michigan. So that was the expectation. I think one thing that sort of happened, and I spoke with a few people on this, including Shadi Hamid publicly, which is that a lot of people across, even just outside Michigan, in the Muslim American community, felt that the Democrats were not even bothering to earn their vote. Whereas at least Donald Trump was willing to engage, even if you could say he's a bad faith actor, but to which people would say, well, all politicians are, at some level, are bad faith actors because they need to say things and do things to earn your vote. And that's your job, right? Your job number one is to show a seriousness, regardless of intent, to earn my vote. And so Donald Trump, I think, did that, and particularly in Michigan, going to Dearborn, engaging with the community there. You see that picture of mainstreaming like imams from Michigan on the Trump, campaign sort of stage, right? By contrast, the Democrats did not even allow a Palestinian American from their own party running for a seat, right, qualified Democrat candidate, to speak at the convention. So I think that was one big issue. I think then there were other faults, that own goals that the Democrats scored, campaigning with Liz Cheney in Michigan at a time when Arab Americans are seeing their families slaughtered by Israeli bombardment through bombs and planes provided by the United States, was like a rub. Rubbed people the wrong way even more so. And then Bill Clinton sort of going out on the campaign trail again in Michigan and saying that Jewish people were in Judea and Samaria way before Islam was invented as a faith, right? So that conversation meant that this arrogance, again, coming back to this dismissiveness, right? You don't have another place, therefore you must stick it out with us. I think a lot of people sort of were like, no, screw you. We'll try our hands at the other place, at the other guy, even if he's a bad faith actor. And then final thing that I constantly picked up, which is interesting, and I would love your thoughts on this as well, is this perception that Donald Trump is the anti-war or pro-peace candidate globally, which it has been internalized by the Muslim American community quite a bit. And they forget, in my view, about Yemen and the amount of bombs he dropped in Afghanistan, which was a high tempo in a decade. But that perception that he's the pro-peace candidate also helped him in the community.
I think my views on this, and so you're just basically forcing me to explicitly state them publicly. But like on the perception versus the reality of Trump demonstrably being less warmongering than any Democratic president in my life, it's not even close, right? And I think that a lot of people do see the Doha peace process as a significant. I think we forget how recent that was. But because of Ukraine and especially because of Gaza. And so we have this view that somehow like that's old history. But I think for a lot of Muslims, and remember, there's huge numbers of Afghans that have migrated to the US in the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah. There's also huge numbers of Pakistanis, especially Pakhtuns, but also people from the old days of the Afghan conflict that have connections and salience in as part of the American fabric. And so I think a lot of that kind of is processed at the mosque level in the US in a way that there is credibility to these perceptions. It's not empty, right? And I think that, frankly, one thing that people maybe realize less is that Trump's likelihood of pressing Israel, even with the clear statements of support that he's made, is greater than anything that any Democrat would be able to pull off, given how much more profoundly controllable Democratic politicians are and have been vis-a-vis AIPAC and other groups like that, versus Trump, who's a total wild card. So the issue isn't that Donald Trump is a nice guy. And it goes again to the sophistication. Just because somebody migrated from Yemen 15 years ago and it speaks English with an accent doesn't mean that that person isn't able to make a distinction between, Trump's genuineness, which may not exist. He may, in fact, be a politician, like all politicians, that acts in bad faith. But because he's a wild card, I think that's what lends some credibility to this. A lot of this is going to be tested right off the bat. And that was my next question. Russia, to me, is the single largest foreign policy issue in America as of right now. And the reason is that Trump hasn't been hinting on what he plans to do. In fact, if it was, I can't remember whether it was Andrew Schulz or whether it was with Joe Rogan, he explicitly refused to answer questions about whether or not he's been speaking to
Putin.
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, Elon's been speaking to him as well. Yeah.
Exactly. So talk, maybe explain to our viewers and listeners what is the likely sort of scenario? How soon do we see a ceasefire in Ukraine and Russia?
So I think there's two things here, right? What I've picked up from people who sort of are on the Russia-Ukraine side of the Trump campaign as an issue that they focus on, their view is that they're quite pragmatic in the sense that they realize that the only way out for this is through a negotiated settlement and an agreement between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and that's what the United States ought to do, while recognizing that from the American perspective, it's actually quite a cheap war to fund, because it's not, in the grand scheme of things, in the US DoD budget, it's not that big of a deal financially for the United States. The challenge, of course, is that, as you said, Donald Trump is unpredictable, and I think he's going to move fast on Ukraine because just there is this anti-war core within the MAGA Republican Party that is going to hold him to account on this particular issue. And the reason to me makes sense, Mosharraf. I mean, like if I think about it, even, and it was something that I feel over the last 2 years at least has not been talked about in the nuance, in the way in which it should have been talked about in mainstream media in the United States. It's either like, if you talk about a different pathway to Ukraine, you're somehow pro-MAGA, which has been like the framing, broadly speaking. And so I'll give you an anecdote, right? A few months ago, I was in West Virginia just hiking and in a cabin, right? And struck up a conversation with a server who is from West Virginia.
I should interrupt you and say, I hope this is not a story that leads to Mount Tibidabo.
No, not at all. But so we struck up a conversation with this woman who's like, I work 3 jobs, one for the state of West Virginia, the great state of West Virginia. We haven't had a raise in like 5 years. And it's very difficult to make ends meet. And I work 2 side jobs, essentially, one as a server on weekends and one as a bookkeeper for a couple of local businesses, because I have some bookkeeping experience. And I was just like, wondering in my mind after that conversation that this person, if she's in West Virginia, if I were to like put her in the general framing of things as a Republican MAGA voter, which is the likely scenario, she probably turns on Fox News or Newsmax at the end of the day and is like, the government of the United States has no money to make my life better, but somehow has these billions of dollars to continue funding the Ukrainians for a conflict. I don't understand its relevance, right? So I think that core exists. And I think the second frustration, again, it's framed in a way that, snooty people like us sort of say, oh, this is like deep state type stuff that Donald Trump loves as a conspiracy. But let's be very honest. And you've lived through this more than I have, in the sense that you had a nation building apparatus, quote unquote, for Iraq and Afghanistan. And guess what? The same organizations, the same types of people who were part of the nation building apparatus in Afghanistan and Iraq are now part of the nation building effort in Ukraine. And we have to have a conversation in the United States about this apparatus that has been created as what I describe as the forever war lobby in the United States, right? And Donald Trump is going to confront it in certain ways, starting with Ukraine, but it's going to make NATO allies, particularly the Germans and the French, very, very nervous the moment he comes into office and starts to rattle that cage again, because they know that if Donald Trump decides to just cut a side deal with Vladimir Putin, then the content is basically on its own.
So I think this is a fascinating conversation, and I think I want to actually get another group together, including yourself, Uzair, to talk about this. Mujtaba Rahman over at Eurasia wrote about this just yesterday, right, or day before yesterday, about how, in his view, and it's a controversial take, but I like it. It's really interesting. He thought that a Trump presidency is what is required to shake Europe out of its kind of somnambulant state. Now, and he makes a really good argument, but what I wanted to ask you about is, forcing a ceasefire in some ways by reducing funding and by kind of engaging with Russia. in a different way, is going to open up Europe to the nervousness and vulnerabilities that you just talked about. But strategically, Trump is not all that stupid or silly, because his argument for Russia, in terms of the zoomed out version, is that you can't have a two-front war globally that the US can fight. And so his idea is that you get Russia to not be antagonistic to the US, and then you go all in on the China conflict. And so, talk a little bit about what you think is likely to happen with China. It seemed as though things were easing up a little bit, and the intensity with which Kurt Campbell had maybe, pushed the envelope on an aggressive, at least competitive and containment type strategy, had begun to soften a little bit. What is going to happen when Trump takes oath on January 20th vis-a-vis China?
Well, so first it starts with Russia, right? I mean, that's the core difference of opinion. I would sort of say this is the John Mearsheimer view of the world, right? That it's kind of disastrous for the United States to pursue a policy that pushes a declining yet extremely powerful Russia into the China camp, because then you have a problem on the Eurasian landmass. And given the civilizational connect, given the history, given the fact that Russia is closer to Western Europe than China, it is best to bring it onto your side and then have that open up space, as you described, to go full throttle on China. I think on China, there is a bipartisan consensus in this town on the fact that the United States, at minimum, has to decouple and de-risk itself from China over the long term. And I think Donald Trump will continue doing that. He will pursue that policy in his own maverick way, right? Which is like try to drive a hard bargain, increase tariffs, use that as a leverage point to talk about something else in particular. But the core sort of operating system around him of advisors that I think in late January that will take oath and enter office will have this view that we got to look at the broader Southeast Asian theater from the point of view that if you are going to be part of the American ecosystem, you have to do something for the United States, number one. And number two, if you're China, then you cannot continue doing this, pursuing this policy of overtly subsidizing manufacturing capacity and then exporting that excess into the United States as a way of policy to enrich yourself. And then I think it'll lead to tensions on the multilateral forum as well. I think the big risk, for example, given that you and I both focus deeply on Pakistan, is the China debt problem. And I think it'll come back. In the fact that I think Donald Trump will pursue and his administration will pursue a more overtly aggressive policy of stating that if you are going to get access to Bretton Woods institutions financing, it cannot be so that then is used to pay off your debts to the Chinese that you have accrued over time. Again, this policy began in 2016, continued subtly under the Biden administration, but I think it'll enter a new phase under Donald Trump. And I think that's, again, one thing that, in the polarized conversation, we forget to give him credit for, is that he fundamentally in 2016 marked a major shift on China policy and extremely aggressively drew concessions from the Democrat Party because they realized this was not a winning issue in terms of saying, oh, we got to have a more nuanced policy towards China.
Unlike a lot of our conversations, Uzair, offline and online, we both committed to making sure that this was a really short and sweet one. It has been fantastic. Thank you for all your insights. I do think we are going to violate our 30-minute sort of
That's fine.
Self-declared moratorium, just because I want to end with, there's a lot more to talk about China and certainly India, but actually skipping that and maybe just the last little bit. And I would say that both of us probably need to contain a degree of skepticism, or maybe even maybe something worse. You forwarded an article the other day about Trump's statement on what's been happening in Bangladesh, or rather, given the facts of the case, what's not been happening in Bangladesh. But clearly, there seems to be a sense that in Bangladesh, that Trump's arrival will cause some sort of reversal of what's happened in that country. And in Pakistan, there's certainly a lot of chatter and I'd say beyond chatter, it's an open talking point that Trump's arrival will mean better things for the political opposition, and in particular, the incarcerated leader in this country, Imran Khan. How, again, without being dismissive of it, I think both of these merit some serious treatment. So on both, I'd love to hear what you think is likely in terms of what Donald Trump is thinking, and then also how that'll play out in the next, let's say, 6 months or so.
Yeah, I mean, look, like it's perfectly likely and plausible that Donald Trump may have a statement or a tweet or something to say about either, Bangladesh is already talked about, as you indicated, but on Mr. Khan and the PTI, right? Completely likely he has people around him that are connected to the PTI universe, and it's a bipartisan engagement. So on that, I've said this publicly before as well, like if you remove the partisan lens of what is going on with the Pakistani American diaspora in Washington, D.C., it's actually a major sort of, heavyweight sort of gain that the diaspora has made in terms of being able to engage Congress and engage both sides of the aisle politically to get what they want. It's a good thing. It's a net positive in the long term for the Pakistani American community to figure out how to move the United States and the system to what they want to achieve, right? It's good to be politically engaged.
We've been talking about this for the last couple of years. This is something that somebody like me has wished to see for 2 decades now, and it's finally happened. It's happened on an issue where maybe perhaps my own preferences are not aligned, but the mechanism or the machine emerging is a glorious thing.
Yeah, and that muscle memory is good and should be appreciated both at home and within the Pakistani American diaspora here in the United States. I think on what could then happen, right, in the next 6 months, like the statement could come, there might be some sort of signal through that. But the way I've been gaming this out is, okay, what is the United States and Donald Trump's ask going to be for a country like Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? Of course, is going to be viewed through the China lens or through the geopolitical lens, largely speaking. And in the Pakistan case, if I then game this out and say, okay, well, what are the things that Donald Trump may want? Those are the things that perhaps the likely mediator or the direct interlocutor for that is the military establishment in Pakistan, right? And if so, the military establishment is the primary interlocutor. Well, what is it that Mr. Khan, via his advisors here in the United States, can offer to the Trump administration that the Pakistani military establishment cannot offer? Which again is a question that I always find it weird that Insafians have not dealt with, is like, well, what is Mr. Khan's view of the United States and your relationship between Pakistan and the United States, given where things stand? And what are you going to do on the China question? What are you going to do on the Iran question, for example, right? And I think that's where my game sort of says that even if Donald Trump is inclined to do something about this, the foreign policy and national security constraints around the relationship will mean, well, first he has to engage with the Pakistani military on this topic. Secondly, I think the issue is, if let's assume, and we sort of alluded and played around with it in the earlier question, right? If Donald Trump continues to provide more space to Israel with the conflict in Lebanon and in Palestine, and even moves in the early days to sort of signal that Iran, if it continues to respond to Israeli aggression, will face even a broader set of attacks, or maybe on its nuclear sites, well, then that leads to pressure on Pakistan as well in terms of, well, what does Pakistan do about it, right? Again, a conversation that has to be had at that political level between the administration and its advisors, saying, okay, what do we want from Pakistan here if we were to go down this path, right? So I think my view, where I stop on the PTI question, is what are the things that a new potential Tehreek-e-Insaf government that comes to power in Islamabad can offer to a Trump administration that the current regime cannot? And that's a question. On the Bangladesh side, I think there are certain indications right now that the interim government is sort of losing steam and losing some level of popularity. There has to be an election at some point in time, but they don't want to have it because there's a fear that a coalition of Islamist parties under the Jamaat may come back, or the BNP, which, like, there are opposing factions within the interim government that don't want that to happen, which then means that if Donald Trump wants to do certain things around Sheikh Hasina and the question of Sheikh Hasina, well, what is the relationship with New Delhi going to be like moving forward, right? And again, that's a question in the sense that if you look at Project 2025 and the trade chapters that are written in that, it mentions both China and India as countries that they want to pursue a fairer trade sort of balance with and call it out. So USTR may get empowered along the way. That might insert volatility into the relationship. But then again, at the same time, Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi have a pretty good relationship. So how does that influence that conversation on Dhaka, right? Remains to be seen. But again, geopolitically, the question will be, what is it that Sheikh Hasina can potentially offer that the interim government backed by the Bangladeshi military cannot offer to a Donald Trump administration at this point in time?
This has been fascinating, Uzair. Thank you so much. Just on that question, I think it's important to distinguish. I think in Bangladesh, it's the right question that one group can't offer the thing that the other one can. But in Pakistan, I think there is a legitimate response that if one was associated with the PTI or one had some sympathy for their position, then one of the responses to the question you asked would simply be, well, they offer political viability and popularity and legitimacy in a way that anything other than Imran Khan is really struggling to sort of coalesce and build and mobilize and demonstrate. So I think that would be the answer. I also think sometimes, and this is harder to say, but I think the thinking in the PTI might be a little more sophisticated than it's given credit for, especially at the Imran Khan end. A lot of this is going to be tested, I think, anyway, so we'll find out. But hopefully we find out things that primarily and singularly, at least for me, and I know for you as well, will help end the slaughter and the genocide in Gaza and its expansion across the Middle East, and then of course. One prays for and wishes for good things for the people in the US that just elected their new leader. And of course, as always, good things for the people of Pakistan, the people in this region, and all around the world. It's been a great conversation, Uzair. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Talk soon, inshallah. Khuda Hafiz.